What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Modern video. And today we're going to be taking a look at Rakdos Scam and its triumphant resurgence back into the Modern format at a time where really I thought Rakdos Scam was pretty much dead, even though it was still kind of doing its thing, and it's not really doing anything different from what it was doing, say, around the Fury banning, and even when we had, the RC in Denver, where, we saw this kind of like Scion / Leyline of the Guild Pack stuff kind of take over, and Scam has found its way back into the metagame, and actually a top 3 deck, according to MTG Goldfish, at the time of the recording of this video, and performed really well at Apex Con for the Apex Invitational. Performed very, very well. I believe ended up at least making the finals. I'm not sure if it actually won because unfortunately I had to work, but at least made the finals of the Modern 5K. Ended up, I believe, being on the second place team on the team event. So performing very well, and won the last 2 Modern challenges as well in back-to-back weekends. So pretty insane, making a great run, and we're going to be going over today exactly why it's seeing this resurgence and how this deck is performing well in essentially a way that, it hasn't really gotten anything, new added to the deck. So, of course, before we get too deep into that, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, I post a lot on Modern, Pioneer, and longer form content. So if you are interested in any of that stuff and you want to see more of it, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when those future videos get posted. Be sure to check out the Casual Spikes podcast that goes up every Saturday, where me and my co-host Randy talk about the Modern and Pioneer format and ways to help level up your game while kind of going over and tackling those metagames respectively. And finally, if you want to support my content even further, you can join one of my memberships where I kind of have some benefits and things like that for a few different tiers. I'm looking to expand on that, as kind of the channel expands as well. So if that's something you want to get into and support my content and me as just a creator, I consider doing that as well. So Rakdos Scam, really, if you look at the deck, it's essentially a Rakdos mid-range deck. You have your Ragavans, your Dauthi Voidwalkers, Kroxa, Orcish Bowmaster, Shieldred, nothing too crazy, Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, typical Rakdos mid-range stuff. The reason why it's called Scam is because of this card called Grief. Grief is a 4-mana 3/2 that says when it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose an non-land card from it, that player discards that card, and it has Evoke, where you exile a black card from your hand. So Evoke says that when this card enters the battlefield, if the Evoke cost was paid, then you have to sacrifice it. So that's a trigger that goes on the stack. So you have 2 separate triggers. You have a trigger from the Grief entering the battlefield, and you have a trigger for the Evoke. So you end up stacking them in a way where you're going to resolve the discard first. And then you're going to look at your opponent's hand, you're going to take a card from it. Then you can cast a card like Not Dead After All, which says then, until end of turn, target creature you control gains. When this creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under your control, then create a Wicked Roll token attached to it. So the creature essentially gets a +1/+1 counter when the aura is put into the graveyard. Each opponent loses 1 life. So this allows you, after the Evoke trigger resolves, the Grief is going to die, which is then going to trigger its ability from Not Dead After All to come back into play with a Wicked Roll token attached to it. So it has a +1/+1 to it, on top of getting to re-up on the discard effect from Grief. And then, of course, if your opponent ever ends up removing the Grief, the aura will go to the graveyard and you will drain them for 1 life. Arguably, in very small ways, like the best reanimate card for getting back Griefs and things like that. And that's where the Scam part of this comes into play. So nothing, again, too crazy about this deck. It's basically just a regular Rakdos mid-range deck. And you can pump people out with a Blood Moon. You have Fable the Mirror Breaker to kind of smooth out your draws, getting up to a point where you can cast Shieldred, and for the most part have the game locked down. Now, why exactly is this good? Especially at a time where, other than really Molten Collapse and Aracious Theater, there's not really much the deck has added to it to, at least be significantly different. So why is it seeing more play now than it was, say, 2 months ago? And the theory that I'm working behind, and kind of backed up by some, Ross and Todd Anderson, is that with a lot of people playing the Leyline of the Guild Pack plus Scion of Draco, combo in their deck, they're essentially starting on like a mulligan, where if your opponent even like keeps a 7-card hand and they have a Leyline of the Guild Pact in their hand, they're going down to 6 cards in hand. Typically, a lot of the time when they're keeping 7s or 6s, it's going to have like Leyline or Scion of Draco or one or the other, if not both. So in those cases, that's kind of like strong enough to keep like the hand, because eventually if you find like a Leyline of the Guild Pact, or like you're really keeping any hand almost as a Leyline of the Guild Pact, you're like keeping it, and if you mulligan down to 6, well, now you have 5 cards in hand going to your opponent's turn, and then you get double Thought Seized essentially, from the Grief plus Not Dead After All, and now you're essentially on 3 cards. In the best case, you have 1 land in hand and 2 other spells, which more than likely you're not going to be able to cast the spells that you are left with. Or in the worst case, all your spells are taken and you're left with just lands in hand, and you're kind of like hoping to top deck. Now, granted, there are surveillance in the format. We saw the Rakdos Theater, where we can kind of surveil and we kind of fix things. But really, aside from that, if you're left with like no fetch lands in hand, or having to kind of play like the slower game, Rakdos midrange kind of takes over. Rakdos Scam. So while you're getting griefed on turn 1, you're also having to contend with Ragavan and Dauthi Voidwalker, which, are good cards on their own. We know that Ragavan can kind of take over a game once it hits the battlefield and goes unchecked. So imagine when you get double Thought Seized, all your interaction gets taken. You're left with either uncastable spells or no spells, and your opponent plays a Ragavan dash on turn 2, and they're able to follow it up with potentially another Thought Seize. They're able to keep up like a Not Dead After All. So if you kill the Grief, or if you kill the Ragavan, what have you, anything in that case, you're able to cast this again, you're able to Lightning Bolt something, you're able to Fatal Push a potential threat. There's a lot of things that you can do for this 1 extra mana. Or you can even take it into like the next turn, and then you have something like Dauthi Voidwalker, you have Croxas, you can go into, things like Fable the Mirror Breaker. There's just a ton of potential that this deck has, from like the early turns of the game, to absolutely put so much pressure on your opponent that it makes it very hard for them to try to come back and win the game. Dauthi Voidwalker, too, with a lot of the format, like a lot of the decks being pretty high powered. I watched a match this weekend where someone had 2 Dauthi Voidwalkers in play, took a Leyline, took a Scion, and then cashed in both Dauthi Voidwalkers to get a Scion plus a Leyline and have like their own combo rather set up in play, which was really neat watching that happen. And that's just kind of the things that Dauthi Voidwalker enables. Seems like Tron's kind of making a resurgence as well, and we all know that Dauthi Voidwalker plus any threat from like the Tron deck is super lethal and worth cashing in your 3/2 basically unblockable creature. While the graveyard, the graveyard hate part on this card is very nice, it makes it very awkward having to deal with a Dauthi Voidwalker in a lot of cases, where you're just hoping that you don't get Thoughtseize, you don't get griefed again, to eventually have like one of your payoffs kind of taken, and Dauthi Voidwalker potentially take over the game. We keep going back to Fable. Fable is probably one of the best mid-range cards like ever printed and currently legal in Modern and in Pioneer. Still legal, or not even legal in Standard, but not too good for Pioneer and Modern. And this card is just absolutely insane. Getting to get to a point where if you have a Grief in play, you can just make a copy of Grief with a flipped Fable the Mirror Breaker on your opponent's draw step, and you just get to take their best card every single turn. Not to mention, you have the Fable combo, where if you have one Fable that is not summoning sick and another one that is flipped, even if it's summoning sick, you can make a copy of it, make a bunch on your opponent's turn equal to the amount of mana you have, and then you can either turn those tokens sideways or copy something like Bonecrusher Giant or Orcish Bowmaster, Dauthi Voidwalker, anything like that, even like other copies of Grief, again. Decimate your opponent's hand, attack for lethal, all those things. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy what this deck is able to do in, colors, I would say, that are like relatively fair. So, I mean, again, like Ragavan, Dauthi Voidwalker, we know these cards aren't really fair, but, they're pretty easy to handle. A lot of the format is playing Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push. With the Leyline combo, we see like Leyline Binding, so that's like a really good way of dealing with something like a Grief, because if you try to kill the Grief while the discard triggers on the stack, your opponent can just respond with a Not Dead After All. And then essentially you using your removal spell will trigger the ability for Grief to come back. And then the evoke trigger won't matter because Grief is a new object, so then it won't actually get sacrificed to the evoke trigger. So really, Rakdos Scam making a resurgence is, I guess, shouldn't be a surprise given the kind of information that we know now. Again, people are, mulliganing pretty aggressively, I would say, like on a base level. Like we know that Scion plus Leyline just kind of lights out for a lot of decks because either it creates a stalemate, and then a lot of the other decks are playing, like Leyline binding, so you can kind of blow out your opponent by getting rid of like their Leyline of the Guild Pact and just being able to smash and, eat all their creatures and then gain a ton of life and put them in a very precarious situation. On top of that, too, I think even at like a higher level, like if you mulligan to 6 and you get your 2 best cards taken, even if you have a removal spell for this grief, you still have to contend with Ragavan, Dauthi Voidwalker, a potential Croxa coming out later down the road, Orcish Bowmaster, building up to something like a Shieldred is absolutely insane. And this deck can just absolutely run you over, and just even if you're prepared for it, it's very hard to kind of pinpoint exactly where to attack this deck, because sometimes it seems to zig when you want to zag and it zags when you want to zig, and it just, again, creates a whole host of problems for people playing against it. I think overall, if you're playing like a domain strategy, you're not necessarily bad against Rakdos Scam, but you definitely put yourself in a pretty bad situation if you're having to stare down a Grief plus a Ragavan, Dauthi Voidwalker, some combination of that start in the first 2 turns of the game. Just because a lot of your spells are going to get taken by Dauthi Voidwalker, a lot of your other spells and potential ramp from the Ragavan deck, you're going to have Blood Moon coming down, and it's just going to be a bad time for your opponents all around. So that is Rakdos Scam for Modern. This deck is absolutely insane right now and is probably okay to pick back up. I mean, the people that have been kind of playing this deck, even when it's been quote-unquote bad in the format, are going to get paid off pretty nicely just from having the reps and everything. They know kind of how the format's leaning, what way it's going to go, and things like that. And Scam's back. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily the good guy in a world where everybody, literally every deck, is playing Leyline of the Guild Pact plus Scion or Draco, but I'm inclined to say that Rakdos is still the bad guy, and all those other decks are the bad guys, and essentially, like, Yawgmoth's somehow the good guy. I don't know how we got to that point, but we are definitely there. So thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this kind of like look at Rakdos Scam, exactly what it's doing, and how it's made a return to the Modern metagame. If you enjoyed the video and you want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel, ring the notification bell, and of course, like the video as well. Leave in the comments down below what Modern deck you would like to see next, as I kind of have a list of decks I want to go over, but if anyone has any suggestions on kind of what to do next, I would greatly appreciate those comments as well as any questions or comments or anything like that about the video. Of course, if you want to support my content even further, please consider becoming a member today. Get shout out on the videos, get shown off in like the description of the videos as well. Some really cool incentives there, and of course, looking to expand in the future. And finally, check out the Casual Spikes podcast that goes up every Saturday with me and my co-host Randy. Go check out his channel as well; it'll be linked in the description down below. That's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed, and I also hope to see you all in the next one.